I was present when we discovered him, exposed except for his socks, leaning against fallen soldiers as if he were merely resting. However, it was not rest. His chest and head were riddled with bullets. His brother Tom lay disemboweled next to him, his scalp torn away. We informed the world that Custer died valiantly, unaffected by the surrounding horrors. But that was untruth. We deceived his widow. We misled the public. And now you are about to learn the reason why. Bodies were violated on this battlefield. Men were mutilated beyond recognition. This is the hidden narrative of what transpired after Custer's final stand. For the triumphant Lakota and Cheyenne, the initial action was to plunder their fallen adversaries. The American soldiers possessed valuable possessions, which now belonged to the victors, just as the soldiers would have done had the circumstances been reversed. Weapons, jewelry, uniforms, badges, and even abandoned horses were seized. Lakota warrior Brave Bear recalled, "There was much commotion and disputes over the horses and guns that were captured. Indians were telling one another, 'I acquired some tobacco, I obtained coffee, I have a good gun.' To the warriors, the spoils of war were a deserved reward. However, this process was harsh for the deceased. Almost everyone was stripped of their clothing and left exposed under the scorching sun. In some instances, feet were severed to facilitate the theft of boots. The Lakota and Cheyenne traditionally took scalps from their fallen enemies, and this battlefield was no exception. For hours, warriors claimed scalps from the deceased as war trophies. Women also participated in the desecration. Cheyenne women later recounted that they had driven nails into Custer's ears. Years later, it was disclosed that someone had forced an arrow into a humiliating area of Custer's body, a detail the Army concealed to shield his widow. According to Lakota warrior Iron Hawk, some of Custer's men feigned death but were discovered by women searching through the battlefield. He remembered witnessing two elderly women strip a man and start to dismember him, only for the soldier to spring up and fend them off. They swiftly killed him. Yet Iron Hawk confessed that he found the image of a naked man fighting against two old women oddly amusing. Not everyone shared a laugh. Reportedly, Sitting Bull himself was disturbed. His visions had foretold victory, but cautioned of a curse if the deceased were disturbed. It remains unclear whether he genuinely opposed the mutilations. Since accounts of his statements emerged years later, he might have been attempting to distance himself from actions condemned by outsiders. Meanwhile, the battle was not yet concluded. A significant portion of the 7th Cavalry still existed under Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Bentyne, entrenched on what became known as Reno Hill. Sitting Bull's warriors tormented them throughout the night of June 25th and into June 26th, ultimately breaking off on the morning of June 27th when scouts reported U.S. reinforcements approaching. Reno and Bentyne had been too preoccupied with their desperate defense to ascertain what had transpired with Custer. It was General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon's forces who revealed the extent of the disaster. Scouts initially stumbled upon bloodied uniforms of U.S. officers abandoned in an empty camp's spoils, left behind when Sitting Bull's warriors retreated. Shortly thereafter, another scout brought even graver news. "I have counted 197 dead bodies lying in the hills." When inquired if they were white men, he responded, "Yes, white men." Terry and Gibbons instantly understood that calamity had befallen them. They feared that the entire 7th Cavalry had been annihilated. But their scouts soon found Reno and Bentyne's survivors. Terry and Gibbons rushed to meet them, discovering them battered yet alive. Both officers had presumed Custer had abandoned them to pursue glory. Instead, they learned of his grim fate. Bentyne and part of his men were dispatched to locate Custer. The scene they encountered was horrific. The bodies of comrades lay decaying after 2 days in the Montana heat. They initially discovered the remains of Company L, commanded by Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun, still positioned in the defensive line where they had perished at Calhoun Hill. In other locations, the deceased were dispersed, either having been killed in a state of panic or relocated post-mortem. Another group of corpses was found on the slope that would later be referred to as Last Stand Hill. Private Jacob Adams was the first to identify the fallen commander. He alerted Captain Bentyne, who confirmed, "By God, that's him." Custer's body was located near the summit of the hill, merely 20 feet away from his brother Tom. Like the others, he was found unclothed except for his socks. Unlike Tom, he had not suffered scalping. His body was positioned as if seated against fellow soldiers, his expression oddly serene, almost resembling sleep. Lieutenant James Bradley later noted that approximately 200 additional bodies from Custer's command were dispersed between the hills and the river, adjacent to Sitting Bull's deserted camp. In a correspondence, he assured the public that the fallen had not been mistreated, claiming that mutilations were minimal. However, this assertion was untrue. Private Charles Windolph later confessed that Bradley's statements were meant to protect grieving families. In reality, the mutilations were horrific. Some corpses were disfigured beyond recognition. Isaiah Dorman, the Black Scout, had been so severely desecrated that a kettle of his blood was left beside him as an affront. Most soldiers had been scalped, pierced with arrows, or struck with axes and war clubs after their deaths. Custer's body officially exhibited only 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest and another to the head, either of which could have proved fatal, in addition to a knife wound in his thigh. However, the more humiliating details, such as the arrow violation, were intentionally omitted from the records to shield Libby Custer. Tom Custer endured a worse fate, having been scalped, his skull crushed, and his body disemboweled. He could only be recognized by a tattoo on his arm. 2 days in the summer heat had caused the bodies to begin decomposing, resulting in an unbearable stench. Colonel Gibbon acknowledged that the scene was overwhelming, and the survivors never forgot it. Some later claimed that everyone on Last Stand Hill had perished by the time reinforcements arrived, but Private Adams remembered things differently. Amidst the corpses, he and others heard a faint sound. It originated from a survivor, a horse. This horse was Comanche, a bay gelding owned by Captain Miles Keogh, who lay wounded yet alive beside his deceased rider. Hit by numerous bullets and arrows, parched and fatigued, the horse had endured days without care, yet remained close to Keogh's body. The soldiers quickly attended to him. While other horses survived the battle, Comanche's suffering and solitary presence on Last Stand Hill rendered him a symbol. He recovered, became the mascot of the 7th Cavalry, and lived until 1891, receiving a full military funeral. On June 27th, soldiers counted and attempted to identify the deceased. Many could not be identified with certainty. 19 bodies were never recovered. Over the years, remains continued to be discovered in the hills, indicating that some soldiers fled the hill only to be hunted down later. The following morning, June 28th, the burials commenced. Benteen counted 208 dead. Bradley counted 206. Regardless, time was limited and danger persisted. Fearing a renewed attack, the soldiers dug shallow mass graves or buried men where they fell. Custer and Tom were interred side by side in a makeshift grave at the base of the hill, wrapped in canvas, with stones placed to deter scavengers. The identity of the gravedigger remains a topic of debate, with several men later claiming the honor. By evening, the burials were completed. General Terry was eager to withdraw. 50 wounded required urgent care, and news of the disaster needed to reach command. The column marched toward the Bighorn River, where the steamer Far West awaited. Along the way, more died en route. For the survivors, the psychological impact was profound. Major Reno sought to numb his pain with alcohol, purchasing 11 gallons of whiskey within weeks of returning. Captain Benteen also resorted to alcohol, ultimately engaging in a dispute with Captain Thomas Weir, who accused him of forsaking Custer. Benteen issued a challenge for a duel, which Weir refused. Overcome with guilt, Weir passed away later that year in his hotel room in New York. Meanwhile, the Far West hastened up the Missouri River, carrying 38 wounded individuals along with the harrowing news. In less than 3 days, it covered 710 miles back to Fort Abraham Lincoln, establishing speed records. At dawn on July 6th, Libby Custer was awakened by the sound of the ship's arrival. Hours later, officers conveyed the news to her and her sister-in-law Maggie. Both women fell into despair. Libby, who had been married to George for 12 years, was his childhood sweetheart. The officers recalled the moment as unbearable, their sobs and tears providing no solace. However, Libby swiftly turned to her responsibilities, accompanying them to comfort the 26 other widows at the fort. Throughout her life, Libby Custer championed her husband's legacy, holding Reno and Benteen accountable for the catastrophe until her death in 1933. The public first became aware of the defeat on July 7th, merely 3 days after celebrating America's centennial. The shocking news overwhelmed the media, igniting discussions regarding accountability, Custer's recklessness, and the failures of Reno and Benteen, or perhaps a combination of both. The nation was left in shock, grieving one of the most significant defeats ever endured by the U.S. Army at the hands of Native warriors. The tragedy lies not only in the hundreds of men who perished that day, but also in how their deaths were swiftly transformed into legend, their suffering softened to protect families and maintain reputations. What does it reveal about a nation when the reality of its most significant battlefield defeat must be concealed beneath meticulously constructed falsehoods? Was Custer celebrated as a hero or fabricated into one? This is the uncomfortable truth that history presents us with. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel to view more captivating history videos like this. Thank you for watching.